we'll go ahead and get started for today. So before we kind of dive into things here, just want to go over the lab final. And so I emailed you guys last week kind of some preliminary, what my kind of expectations were for the lab final. Basically, the way it's going to work is it's going to cover all the labs we've done so far. So let me kind of write it up here on the side. So for the lab final, let me do this in red. So the lab final, it's going to be 25 questions for a total of 50 points. It's going to be all multiple choice. So 25 multiple choice questions, again, for a total of 50 points. And so the first 12 questions, so questions 1 through 12, are going to be coming from the new stuff that we've done. So the respiratory, it's going to come from renal, and it's going to come from the digestive system, which we'll cover today. Okay. Questions 13 through 25 are going to come from the previous lab quizzes. Okay. So if you study the lab quizzes, which you should hopefully still have access to, I think, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I think you still have access to the lab quizzes. So you can use those to study for the lab final as well, because I'll be pulling questions from there. I may be pulling from the multiple choice. I may be pulling from the free response questions from the previous quizzes and then making them into multiple choice questions for the lab final. Okay. So everything is fair game on the lab final. And then there's also going to be possibly 1 to 2. I'm leaning towards 2 extra credit questions. So that's that. And then, so the way I'm going to have this open is I'm going to have this open from this Thursday up until next Thursday. Okay, so you have a whole week to take the lab quiz. And the reason I'm doing it that way was this Thursday, the 7th to the 14th. So you have a week to take it. And so the reason I'm doing it this way is to give you enough time. If you finish up the digestive lab quickly enough, you can just complete the lab final on this Thursday or sometime this week and then be done with lab. Or if you want extra time to study for the lab final, turn it in, or study for the digestive physiology lab, turn it in next Tuesday at the latest. And then you still have a couple extra days to study for the lab final. So you've got plenty of time to take it. Once you're done with the digestive system or the digestive physiology lab and the lab final, you are done with Bio 9 lab forever. Cool? All right, yeah, so we're at the home stretch. We're at the home stretch. Cool. Any questions on how the lab final is going to work?
No.
Okay. So this will be up on Canvas, like I said, on Thursday, probably around Thursday at noon, or so, somewhere around that time. I'll send an email when it's active. So that'll be ready for you. And then again, you'll have an entire week to take it. So from this Thursday up until next Thursday, you've got a whole week to take the lab final. Again, once you're done with that, you're done with Bio 9 forever and you're good to go. Cool.
Cool.
All right. Any last minute questions before we go forward here? No? Okay. Looks like we're good. All righty. So that is that. Actually, let me go ahead and clear this out the way. Okay. All right. So today we're going to be dealing with our final lab of the semester, which is the digestive physiology lab. So most of this kind of PowerPoint is going to be review from anatomy from Bio 7. So this should kind of be review, but there's going to be a few things that we're really going to be focusing on, namely on the different processes for how we're going to be digesting different types of foods. Okay. So before we go forward, what are the kind of 3 major food types, I guess? Can anyone tell me off the top of their head?
Protein.
Okay, so we got proteins.
Carbs. No protein.
Carbs, yeah. So we got proteins, we got carbs, and what else do we have?
Fats.
One more.
Sugar?
Fats. Right.
Okay.
Well, sugars are carbs.
Yeah.
So those are the three major food groups we're going to be looking at today, and we're going to be looking at how we're going to be able to digest these different types of foods. Okay. So if we think of proteins, we're going to be thinking of things like chicken, turkey, meat, things like that. Okay. When we think of carbs, we're thinking of like bread, pasta, what else off the top of my head? Anything that's got like carbs and sugar in it. And then fats, we're looking at like butter and things like that. Okay. So whipped cream, all that good stuff. Okay. So those are going to be the different types of things we're going to be thinking about as we go through our digestive physiology kind of lab here. Okay. So when we look at the digestive system, we're going to kind of take a holistic view, and then we're going to kind of get into the nitty gritty here. So the overall role of the digestive system, as we know, is to break down food. And we want to break down these large chunks of food into smaller components that can then be able to be absorbed by the body's cells and then used for energy later on. Okay. So when we look at the digestive system, it's going to be divided up into two kind of tracks. The first one is the gastrointestinal tract. And that's just essentially one really long tube, starting with the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. And all of that is just one long tube, just all kind of compacted in different areas. And then we're going to have the accessory digestive organs, which are these individual organs that help with the digestive process. So those would be the teeth, the tongue, the salivary glands, which we see up here, the liver right here, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Okay. So all of those are going to assist with the digestive process, but they themselves will not be breaking anything down, I guess, per se, or directly, I guess, okay, with the exception of the teeth. Okay, so the overall function of the digestive system, there's going to be 6 overall functions. The first one is ingestion. So obviously, if you want to digest anything, you have to first ingest it and bring it into your mouth and into your system, so you can then degrade it and destroy it. Okay. The second thing we're going to be doing is we're going to have secretion. Okay. So we're going to be secreting lots of different substances like water, acids, different buffers, and then, but most importantly, we're going to be secreting a lot of enzymes. Okay. And those enzymes are going to be really important to help us be able to break down fats and carbohydrates and lipids, or proteins. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, those are going to be the second function, secretion, specifically with the enzymes. Okay. The third function is with the action of moving our molecules and moving our food from point A to point B. And that's called mixing and propulsion, or also called motility. Okay. So the motility of the GI tract is going to be regulated by the smooth muscle contractions. So it's going to contract in one area and relax in another in order to help kind of push the food further down the GI tract, kind of like you're squeezing toothpaste out of a toothpaste container or tube. Okay. Cool, that's number 3. Number 4 is one of the most important ones, which is digestion. Okay. So digestion is just a breakdown of food. Okay. So we need to break down our food into smaller components. The way we're going to be doing that is we're going to be kind of having some mechanical digestion as well as some chemical digestion. Okay. So mechanical digestion just has to do with the physical breakdown of food and actually physically, breaking down to smaller components, using the teeth to kind of cut it up, or using the stomach to kind of churn and break it down into smaller components, as well as the small intestine to a lesser degree. So you're actually physically breaking things down. Then the other type of digestion we can have is chemical digestion. Okay. So chemical digestion is where you're using the enzymes to help break down the carbohydrates, the lipids, and the proteins into much more small molecules, much more kind of microscopic molecules, so you can then be able to absorb them through the digestive tract. Okay. Okay, which brings us to function number 5, which is absorption. Okay. So it doesn't do your body any good to just break things down but not absorb it. So here we need to take all the molecules that we just broke down, the broken down proteins, the broken down lipids, the broken down carbohydrates, and we need to absorb them into the cells of our GI tract. Okay. Once they get absorbed into our GI tract cells, namely in the small intestine, we're then going to push those molecules into the blood, and then the blood can then transport those substances where they need to go. Okay. So that's going to be the absorption process, taking things from the GI lumen into the cells of your GI tract, and then directing it into the blood. Okay. And then the last process is pooping or defecation. Okay. So all of the substances that we're not going to digest or absorb, those are going to end up as our feces or our poop. Okay. So that's going to be made up of any waste, anything that we were not able to digest, any bacteria, any sloughed off cells from the GI tract, or anything that was digested and not absorbed. Okay. That all of that stuff is going to end up leaving the body as feces. Cool. Okay, so that's our functions. Any questions on the function of the overall GI system or the digestive tract before we go forward here? Should all be relative, should be reviewed. Should all sound familiar. Cool. Okay. All right, so we're going to look at the different components here. And so the first kind of most important part of the GI tract is going to be in the mouth. Okay? And so the mouth is going to be where we're going to find our teeth. Our teeth are going to kind of cut up and break down our food mechanically. But then we're also going to have some glands in here called the salivary glands. And what they're going to do is they're going to help to break down some food. But mainly what they're going to be breaking down is starch. Okay? So starch is a type of carbohydrate. And so in order to break down carbohydrates, the salivary glands are going to release an enzyme called salivary amylase. Okay. So salivary amylase is the enzyme in the mouth that helps to break down starch or carbohydrates. Okay. So that's going to be the first enzyme that we see. Okay. So this is typically how this is going to work. So here we're going to have a larger starch molecule or glycogen or a long carbohydrate. We introduce amylase to it, okay? And so amylase will then split that very large carbohydrate into much smaller components. Okay? So as it breaks it down into smaller components, then we're going to use other enzymes to help break them down into even smaller components that we can then absorb from there. Okay? So salivary amylase is going to be the first one to help break down starch. Okay? However, it's going to serve mostly a relatively limited role. It's not going to do a whole lot in terms of starch breakdown, but it does, break down starch here. Okay, that's the salivary glands. Okay. So then as we swallow our food, the food is going to move from the mouth into the pharynx, then into the esophagus. And so the role of the esophagus is to transport that food from the mouth down into the stomach. Okay. So the esophagus is going to be regulated by two sphincters. And there's going to be an upper esophageal sphincter at the junction between the mouth, or I guess between the larynx or the pharynx and the esophagus. And so when that sphincter relaxes, that's going to allow us to be able to swallow food and not allow it to move into the esophagus. Okay. Once that food enters the esophagus, we're going to have a peristalsis process. And so peristalsis is going to be an involuntary coordinated contractions that are going to help move the food from the top of the esophagus all the way down to the bottom until it reaches the lower esophageal sphincter, which we see right here. Okay. So this lower esophageal sphincter is going to be a sphincter that's going to relax as the food reaches that particular area. And when it relaxes, that's going to allow the food to enter the stomach. Okay. So here we don't have any enzymes being involved. We have no food breakdown. All that's happening here is just movement of the food from the mouth down into the stomach. Okay. All right, so then we reach the stomach. And so the stomach helps to connect the esophagus that's kind of above it to the duodenum, which comes after it. And the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. And so the major role of the stomach is to act as a kind of holding location for the food. Okay, so when we eat lots of food, it's going to get stored here in the stomach. And then from there, the stomach is going to have all kinds of other contractions like peristalsis. And that's going to help to mix the food with a lot of the gastric juices to kind of help break it down a little bit further. Okay? So it's going to be a mixing area as well as a holding reservoir. Okay? And then every so often, the stomach is going to squeeze a little bit of that food out of the stomach and into the duodenum, where we can have further digestion and absorption. Okay. So the main role of the stomach is to assist with the digestion of the stomach, or of the starch, proteins, and triglycerides, which are fats. Okay. So all three of those are going to be getting broken down inside the stomach, and we're going to look at exactly how that's going to take place in a second. So when we look at the cells in the stomach, there's going to be a few different types. The first type of cell are called the mucous neck cells. And so the mucous neck cells will secrete mucus. And so the mucus will help to protect the lining of the stomach from the hydrochloric acid that gets produced from the parietal cells. Okay. So the hydrochloric acid is the actual acid that helps to form our stomach acid. So that's going to be formed by the parietal cells. Okay. Then we have a third type of cell called chief cells. And so the chief cells will be secreting two enzymes. The first one is going to be pepsinogen, and then the other enzyme is going to be gastric lipase. Okay. So both of these two enzymes are going to be really, really important in terms of digestion inside the stomach. Okay. So we got some hydrochloric acid. We have our stomach acid being produced by the parietal cells. We have some mucus to help protect the lining of the stomach. And then we have pepsinogen and gastric lipase in doing the kind of the digestive work here. Okay. So all of these different secretions that get produced inside the stomach are collectively known as the gastric juice. Okay, so when we're looking at the stomach, there's going to be two, like we said, two enzymes that are going to be involved with digestion. Okay. The stomach is going to not really be important when it comes to absorption, but it's going to be the place where most of the digestion is going to be occurring, okay? Or a good portion of the digestion will be occurring. Okay. The two enzymes are going to be pepsin and gastric lipase. Okay. So pepsin is going to be the active form of pepsinogen, which we just saw previously. And so when we release pepsinogen, pepsinogen itself is not able to do anything. Okay. The only time pepsinogen becomes active is when it's been exposed to acid, okay, namely the stomach acid or the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Once pepsinogen comes into contact with acid, it becomes activated, and the activated form is now called pepsin. Okay. And so what pepsin is able to do is it will break down proteins into smaller protein fragments called peptides. Okay. So this is where we're going to see some protein digestion happening inside the stomach. So that's going to be the first enzyme. The second enzyme is going to be gastric lipase. And so gastric lipase is an enzyme that helps to break down lipids. And so it's going to be able to break down fat into individual fatty acids and monoglycerides. So these will typically have a relatively limited role, or gastric lipase doesn't have that much of a role inside the stomach, but it does play a significant role here. Okay, any questions so far on anything we've talked about already? Okay.
No.
All right. Cool. Okay, so that's digestion. So it's, again, pepsin and then gastric lipase, and the two enzymes inside the stomach that are going to be the most important ones. Okay. So what's going to be happening here is as the gastric lipase, as the pepsin, as the rest of the gastric juice components start to mix with the food, okay, that we just swallowed, okay, we're going to start to basically have some peristaltic contractions happening inside the stomach as well. Okay. So that peristalsis will do is it's going to help to mix the food that we just swallowed with the gastric juices, and then kind of convert that food into from a more solid or a semi-solid bolus into a more soupy liquid that we call chyme. Okay. So chyme is a mixture of the food with the gastric juice that we just produced, and we just made it into a liquid form. Okay. And then every so often, the stomach is going to release some of that chyme into the duodenum through a process called gastric emptying. Okay, so then at that point, the food now enters the small intestine. Okay. So before we get to the small intestine, we got to talk about a few other organs first, because the small intestine is going to be, or the action of the small intestine is going to be dependent on the activities of the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder. Okay. The small intestine cannot work without those three individual organs. Okay. So the first one we're going to look at is the pancreas. And so the pancreas is going to sit right behind the stomach, and it's also going to connect to the duodenum of the small intestine using two different ducts. Okay. So the first duct is called the pancreatic duct, okay, which we see here. So the pancreatic duct pretty much goes the entire length of the pancreas, and then it will eventually join up with the common bile duct, okay, from the liver. Okay. And as they join up together, they're going to end up forming the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Okay. So if we kind of zoom into this process here we would see the pancreatic duct, here we see the common bile duct. As they fuse together, they're going to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla, and again, that will open up into the duodenum. Okay. So those are the two ducts there, or the two ducts that will kind of join together there. In addition to that, we're also going to have the accessory duct. And so, the accessory duct runs from the kind of pancreatic duct and then will eventually lead directly into the duodenum itself. Okay, so those are the two ducts that are going to be important here. Okay. Now, these two ducts are going to be able to transport a few different enzymes into the duodenum. Okay. So those kind of substances that get released from the pancreas are called the pancreatic juice, and that's going to be made up of mostly water, some salt, some alkaline fluid that helps to kind of buffer the stomach acid inside the chyme, as well as a bunch of enzymes. Okay. So the enzymes that the pancreas is going to release are going to be able to digest pretty much all three of the different types of foods. Okay. So we're going to release pancreatic amylase. Okay. And so pancreatic amylase is going to kind of be the more potent version of the salivary amylase that we saw previously. And so that's going to help to break down starch into smaller disaccharides. Okay. So that's going to be where we're going to be able to break down some carbohydrates. We're going to have a bunch of enzymes that can break down protein. Okay, one of them is going to be trypsin. We have chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, and elastase. And there's a bunch of other different types of pancreatic protein digesters, I guess, protein enzymes that'll help to break down protein. Okay. And then there's a third one called pancreatic lipase. And so pancreatic lipase is kind of, the more potent version of gastric lipase. And so it helps to break down triglycerides or fats into smaller components, into glycerol, into some fatty acids. And again, we can then be able to break this down a little bit further and then be able to digest them that way. So the majority of the enzymes that are going to be involved with digestion are going to come specifically from the pancreas. So the pancreas is going to produce all these enzymes, direct them into the duodenum of the small intestine, and then all these enzymes are going to be able to work to help break down their individual foods. Okay, any questions on these enzymes here? Just kind of feel okay so far. Okay, cool. All right, so that's the pancreas. Okay, so pancreas, like I said, is able to digest fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. Okay. Now, the next structure we're going to have, the next organ we're going to have here is the liver. And so the liver is going to be responsible for helping to produce bile. Okay. There's going to be another organ that sits underneath it, which is called the gallbladder. Okay. And so the gallbladder is kind of this green organ that helps to store the bile. Okay. So the liver produces bile, the gallbladder will then store it. So the bile is going to be important because this will help to emulsify fats. And this is just a fancy way of saying that bile helps to break down these larger lipid droplets into smaller components. Okay. And then now that they're in smaller components, then they're going to be able to be absorbed a little bit easier. Okay. So it's going to help with emulsification as well as absorption of those lipids. Okay. All right, so that's that. So the particular cells that are going to be responsible for producing bile are going to be the hepatocytes. Okay, so the hepatocytes are going to be the liver cells that produce the bile. And so once that bile gets produced, it's going to run through a series of ducts. It's eventually going to exit out of the liver through the right and left hepatic ducts. Those right and left hepatic ducts will then join together to form the common hepatic duct. The common hepatic duct joins with the cystic duct, exiting from the gallbladder, okay, to form the common bile duct. And then the common bile duct will then join with the pancreatic duct to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Okay. So the common bile duct will eventually open up into the duodenum, and that's going to be where we're going to be able to drop off that bile to help break down fats inside the intestine, the small intestine. Okay, so this is just kind of a little schematic to kind of show you kind of where that bile is going to be going from. From the left and right hepatic ducts, they're going to join together to form the common hepatic duct. Common hepatic duct joins with the cystic duct to form the common bile duct. And the common bile duct will then lead into the duodenum. And there's going to be a sphincter that is going to control the entry of the bile into the duodenum. So that sphincter is called the sphincter of Oddi. Okay. And there's going to be certain periods where the sphincter of Oddi is going to be open and certain time periods where it's going to be closed. So the sphincter of Oddi is typically going to be closed if there's no food inside the small intestine. Okay? So if we're in between meals and we haven't eaten for a long period of time, there's no food in the small intestine, specifically here in the duodenum, then there's no reason for us to be producing bile, or I guess putting bile into the duodenum, right? If there's no food there, there's no need to put bile there to digest anything because there's nothing there. So that sphincter is going to be closed. Okay? And so when the liver produces that bile, okay, it's going to come down, eventually come down the common bile duct. It's going to reach the sphincter of Oddi, but because there's no food there, the sphincter of Oddi is going to be closed, and that's going to cause the bile to back up. Okay? And so as it backs up, it's eventually going to back up along the common bile duct, enter into the the cystic duct, and then drop off right into the gallbladder in order to get stored. Okay? So that's going to be where the gallbladder is going to make its money in terms of storage of bile. Okay? And that's going to happen specifically when the sphincter of Oddi is closed. Okay. Now, when we have eaten a meal, okay, when we do have food in our small intestine, okay, specifically what's going to happen is the fatty acids and the amino acids inside the chyme is going to trigger the release of a hormone called cholecystokinin, or CCK. Okay. Now, what CCK does is it's going to cause the gallbladder to contract. Okay. And as the gallbladder contracts, it's going to be squeezing the bile that it's been storing out through the cystic duct, down the common bile duct, and then through the sphincter of Oddi and into the duodenum. Okay. So that's going to be where we're going to be dropping off our bile here. Okay. What CCK also does, it helps to relax the sphincter of Oddi so that it opens up so that you get nice, easy bile flow into the duodenum. Okay. Any questions on this process? I know I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit faster. Any questions here?
No.
No? Okay, cool. All right, so that's going to be how we're going to be getting all those digestive enzymes and substances into the small intestine. Okay? Now, once all that substance gets into the small intestine, now the small intestine can now work. Okay? It's going to be using the enzymes that came from the pancreas as well as the liver to help with the digestion process that's going to take place inside the small intestine. Okay? So as we digest all those different substances, they're eventually going to get absorbed. And so because the small intestine has lots of folds and lots of villi and microvilli, the surface area of the small intestine is going to be very, very high. Okay? And so with a high surface area, that is going to allow the small intestine to be able to absorb as much nutrients as it possibly can. Okay? So the more surface area you have, the more substance you can absorb. Okay? The higher your absorption ability is. And so the small intestine is going to begin at the pyloric sphincter of the stomach, and it's going to kind of coil around here until it eventually leads into the large intestine. So there's three regions of the small intestine. The first region is called the duodenum, which we've kind of talked about extensively here. Then there's the jejunum, which is the middle region. And then the last region is the ileum. Okay? And so the ileum is the longest part, and that's going to end up joining with the large intestine. And so it's going to join at the ileocecal valve, or the ileocecal sphincter. Okay. Once that food passes through the small intestine, it's eventually going to reach into the large intestine, which is the last part of the GI tract. Okay. And so the large intestine is going to have lots of bacteria that are going to be able to act on that chyme. Sorry, the sun's in my face here. So it's going to have a lot of bacteria that's going to be able to act on the chyme. And then we'll see kind of what the bacteria is going to be able to do in a little bit. So we're going to have bacteria. We're going to have water absorption taking place here. We're going to have some extra ion absorption taking place here, as well as some vitamin absorption. Okay. So water, ions, and vitamins are all going to be absorbed inside the large intestine. And as we absorb all those different substances, that's going to help us to form feces, okay, form our poop. Okay. So basically how this is going to go is we're going to have our ileum that's going to lead into the large intestine. And then the large intestine is going to kind of coil around here, around the small intestine. And we're going to have four major components, okay, and eventually lead it into the anus. Okay. First region is going to be the cecum, and that's going to be where the small intestine leads into the large intestine. We're going to have the colon, which is going to be the major portion of the large intestine. Then we're going to have the rectum, which is going to be kind of the end part, and then the anus, which is going to be the very end, okay, or the anal canal. So if we kind of zoom in on the rectum and the anal canal, the rectum is going to be kind of at the more superior regions, it's going to be a little bit higher up, and then we eventually reach the anal canal. Inside the anus, this is going to be where the kind of large intestine opens up to the exterior. Okay, this is going to be where the pooping process, the defecation process, is going to be taking place. Okay? So the anus has two different sphincters in it. The first one is called the internal anal sphincter. And that one is involuntarily controlled. That one is mainly controlled by the autonomic nervous system. That one is involuntary. Okay, we cannot control that one. Okay. However, we do have an external anal sphincter. And so the external anal sphincter is one that is voluntary. That one is made of skeletal muscle, so we can physically control that one. Okay. So if you ever think of like a time where you really have to go poop, but you have to hold it and you kind of have to squeeze your butt cheeks a little bit, okay, where you're squeezing is specifically here the external anal sphincter, which we see right here. Okay. So that's the part that we're actually physically able to control. Okay. Now, when we allow these both to release, or when we kind of release the pressure here and allow relaxation of both of these sphincters, that is what's going to allow us to be able to defecate and poop. Okay. Last thing that's going to be happening here is we're going to have a bunch of bacteria inside the colon region of the large intestine. Okay. The bacteria is pretty much going to be acting on the carbohydrates and the proteins. And so if the bacteria start to come into contact and ferment with any of the carbohydrates inside your chyme, okay, what's going to happen is they're going to start the bacteria are going to break down those carbohydrates, and they're going to release hydrogen, they're going to release carbon dioxide, and they're going to release methane. Okay, all of which are gases, which is where we get our farts from. Okay, that's going to be our flatus. Okay, so that's going to be where we get our gas from. The second thing that's going to be happening is our bacteria are also going to be breaking down any extra remaining proteins and amino acids. Those substances that they break down will contribute to the odor of the feces. And then the last thing that's going to be taking place is the bacteria going to break down a molecule called bilirubin into stercobilin, and that helps to give the feces its brown color. Okay. That's what the bacteria are going to be doing inside the colon. Okay. Now, after this whole process is taking place, the chyme is typically going to be spending about 3 to 10 hours inside the large intestine, okay, depending on what we're eating. Okay. During this period of time, water is going to be slowly getting absorbed. Okay. So if you remember, the chyme at this point is going to be mostly liquid. Okay. The food that's entering into the large intestine is going to be mostly liquid at this point. And so what's going to be happening here is the large intestine is going to be pulling water out, okay, of that chyme. Okay. So as it pulls water out, the chyme is now going to become a little bit more solid. It can either be solid or semi-solid, and that is what's going to give kind of feces its main kind of appearance. Okay, its thickness, I guess, for lack of a better word. And so that is going to be our feces. And so the feces ultimately, like we talked about before, is going to be made up of anything that we weren't able to digest or anything that was digested but not absorbed. It's going to have lots of water and salts. It's going to have lots of bacteria that we are pooping out, and then any epithelial cells from the GI tract that we that have sloughed off at that point. Okay. So that is the large intestine. Okay. The last slide here is just a kind of a table that has all the enzymes that we looked at already. So these are the major enzymes that are going to be responsible for helping to break down certain substances. Okay, this is not an all-intensive list or all-conclusive list. Okay? But these are just the ones that we looked at today. There are a few others, obviously, but these are the major ones. Okay? So starch, in order to break down starch, we're going to be using salivary amylase from the salivary glands, the pancreatic amylase from the pancreas. In order to break down protein, we're going to have pepsin from the stomach. Again, that has to be activated by the stomach acid. Okay. So low pH environments help to activate pepsin. And in addition to that, we're also going to have trypsin, carboxypeptidase, chymotrypsin, elastase. And again, there's a bunch of other ones. There's one that we're going to be seeing in the lab as well, okay, that helps to break down protein. And these are all released from the pancreas. And then to break down lipids, we have gastric lipase, which is in the stomach. We have pancreatic lipase, which comes from the pancreas, and then bile, which gets released from the liver. Okay. And all these help to break down lipids. Okay, that is it. Any questions on any of these enzymes or anything that we've talked about so far?
No.
Okay. All right. So that is going to lead us into our lab for this week. And so this week's lab is going to be relatively straightforward. So is everyone able to see the lab now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. So we're going to be watching 3 videos, and you're going to do this on your own time when you do the lab. There's 3 videos, and one of them is going to be looking at how we're able to digest starch using a particular enzyme, using amylase. There's going to be another video where they're doing a lab on how proteins get digested, okay? And then there's the third one on how fats get digested. Okay? So watch all 3 of these videos, okay? And then once you watch all 3 of these videos, you're going to answer these 6 questions here. Okay? You will need to watch the videos in order to answer some of these questions. So don't think you can just kind of skip through the videos and not do them, because you do got to kind of watch them in order to see how all this is going to work here. Okay? So watch the videos, answer the questions. That's pretty much it for this week's lab. Cool. So this will be due next Tuesday. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Any questions on what we're doing for this lab?
No.
Nope. Okay. All right. So if there's no questions, you guys are free to go. Like I said, this will be due next week, and the lab final will be uploaded on Thursday, and again, you'll have a week to do that. So from this Thursday to next Thursday. Next week, we won't have any lab. Okay, we'll just have the lab final at some point, which you'll do on your own time. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So this will be the last time I see you. Oh man, that just hit me. This is the last time I'll see you guys. Yeah. So it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed having you all in class. Best of luck in all your future endeavors, and when you apply to your nursing programs or whatever medical programs you're going to be going into. If you guys ever need any help or any assistance with anything, or if you ever need someone to talk to, feel free. You can always reach out to me.